So, thanks so much for being here. Just before we get started, just a few words of introduction about Louis Jacobs Foundation, if anyone's confused as to where they are and why, and also about the three of us and what we're doing here, and what the goal is for this evening. So I'm Adam Zagoria-Moffet. I'm the rabbi at St. Albans Masorti Synagogue. I'm also the director of Louis Jacobs Foundation and lots of other things in addition. This evening's program is going to focus a little bit on heresy, which I've been accused of many times, so I'm a bit of an expert. And we're going to look at three famous British Jews who were also accused of heresy. It's a great club to be in, as you'll see.
Very good to see everybody. I'm Simon Eder. I'm the Education Director at the Friends of Louis Jacobs. I also host the weekly podcast Jewish Quest that explores the Parsha.
Available anywhere you get podcasts, by the way.
Thank you for the plug, and been working with Ivor for a number of years. Just to share, if I may, amongst Ivor's many accolades, yesterday was that many people will know, was the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the founding of New North London Synagogue that Ivor and Hitzer were founding members of, together with plenty of others here, and wonderful that we mark that 50th anniversary, and again one of Ivor's many candles that he has bestowed us with.
Yeah. In addition to tech guru knowledge over here as well. Yeah.
Can you use the microphone?
Yes, sorry. We will do our best to use them. Go on.
Good evening, everyone. So, my name is Ariel Abel. I was born and raised in Manchester. I noticed a couple of faces here who actually know about me from early on my days. Before I launched myself, after training in Israel, into communities, Berlin, then largely Liverpool, and here in London, where I looked after the Walthamstow, which is now amalgamated with another synagogue, and then ran synagogues, and during that time set up and ran with the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, then Chief Rabbi, and Rabbi Dr. Abram Levy, also the late, the Montefiore program, which was to provide rabbis for the future for congregations. So I wrote that program, put it together, got it organised and on the road. It runs very much without me these days. And later returned north, qualified as a solicitor. I do now practice as such, and trained at Sandhurst, and part-time look after the Northwest medics for the British Army. So not the Jewish soldiers only, but the whole regiment up there. So that's sort of me more or less introduced.
Also accused of heresy on a number of occasions.
Yes.
I wouldn't even be here if I wasn't. I have to qualify, surely.
Yes, well, it's assumed, I think, at this point. So what we're going to do this evening is try and talk about three particular personalities in British history. Each of us has been tasked with giving the explanation of the controversies for three rabbis. Myself, I'm going to talk about Rabbi David Nieto, and then more famously Rabbi Sacks and Rabbi Jacobs. I want to start with David Nieto, and I want to read you the paragraph in question that provoked the huge controversy I'm going to tell you about, which is, I'm going to do my best to be really loud. No,
They've gone.
Right, I'm going to do my best to be really loud. If anyone needs to move to the front, this is getting to be like a joke. There's a panto downstairs, but nobody's working.
Broadcasting downstairs.
Yeah, it must be, that's what it is. So, Rabbi Nieto said the following. It's not very long, and actually, there was a huge controversy that resulted from it. So I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to think to yourself, does this sound like heresy to me? My beloved brethren, listen to me clearly and know that what I am going to say is a fundamental belief of our people, as it has been since we were founded. There is no such thing as nature. The word simply does not exist in the Hebrew language. About 500 years ago or so, some people took the word teva and decided to use it to describe what they called the laws of nature. But in truth, no such thing exists. King David writes in his Psalms that God covers the sky with clouds and prepares rain for the ground. Indeed, God is nature, and nature is none other than God. Right, quick show of hands. Heresy? One half-hearted suggestion to maybe. Ivor goes, yeah, maybe.
Yes.
Okay, well, the key thing was that in David Nieto's time and place, this was absolutely up for debate. And he's a really interesting figure to start this conversation with, because in many ways he starts at the beginning of modern British Jewish history. He was brought over from Venice to be the first full-time rabbi of Bevis Mark's synagogue, which opened in 1701, and he arrived in 1702. So he is the first rabbi to really serve in that role. And the significance of Bevis Marks will be known to many people as not only the longest continually running synagogue in the UK, but also a very prominent and prestigious one being in the city of London, and with a rich history that goes from then all the way up until today. Rabbi Nieto was born in Venice. He was trained in Venice. He went to become a doctor in Padua. In the tradition of many great rabbis, some here included, he had multiple careers. And served in many roles in addition to being a community rabbi. He worked as a physician almost full-time before coming to England. And when he came to be the rabbi of Bevis Marks, it was on the understanding that he would be there to educate and to uplift the literacy of the Spanish and Portuguese community, who was not yet called that, really. At the time, the Spanish and Portuguese community was largely still identifying as in what we would today call conversos, although that language wasn't used then, or B'nai Anusim, or any other language. And we're still learning about the Judaism they had reclaimed in many families only a generation or two prior. So education was given a huge value, because for many people, they were very enthusiastic about their Jewish life, but actually didn't know very much about how to live a Jewish life. They knew an awful lot about Christian scripture and tradition, because they had worked for a very long time to pretend to be Christians, and now having to deprogram that, we might say, and relearn Judaism was a challenge that was undertaken by the whole community at once. A quite rare and special moment in Jewish history, and a fascinating example of many things. Nieto was a well-educated, intellectual guy. He spoke Spanish and Portuguese and Italian. He actually was ashamed of his English level, but it seems to have been just fine based on the records of his sermons that have survived from Bevis Mark's archives. And he was someone who in many ways was a very mainstream person. But that little paragraph that I read you, which is from a sermon he delivered in November 1703 on Parshat Vayishlach, created such a stir that it almost tore Bevis Marks apart. It had only been around for 3 years, and it was almost torn apart into many communities. And it very nearly did. Now, the history of it is interesting, because I think it tells us a lot about heresy, which is the question we want to investigate this evening. Is heresy a thing? Who's the real heretic, if it is such a thing? And how do you identify it? Well, and this is an experience perhaps people can relate to, there was one particular person who was in shul that day, although he wouldn't have called it shul, would have called it synagogue probably, named Joshua Tzarfati, who heard Rabbi Nieto give this sermon, and immediately went, this is heresy. I don't like this. He didn't tell anyone, though, right away. Instead, he stormed out, every classic approach that you can imagine, and 3 weeks later, there was a wedding held for another member of the community, and when Tzarfati went to the wedding and got to the door and realized that Rabbi Nieto was there at the wedding, he refused to go in and made a huge stink of standing outside and telling everyone that was going into the wedding that actually they shouldn't go in because there was a heretic in their midst. This got him in some interesting trouble in his own right. It resulted in him being called before the Mahamad, right, the council as we would call it today, and having to answer for his bad behavior at this wedding, which gave him an opportunity to present his argument that Rabbi Nieto's statement that nature was God and God is nature is nothing other than rank pantheism a la Spinoza. Now, Spinoza, also a member of the Spanish and Portuguese community in Amsterdam at the Esnoga, capital T, capital E, was only dead now for 50, 60 years. His writings were spreading very rapidly, and there was a lot of anxiety, I suppose, in that community in particular around accusations of Spinozism, which is quite a word. But the other thing that challenged a lot of Nieto's discourse is that this is 1703. Isaac Newton is in vogue in the intellectual circles of London. Everyone in Christian communities is either suggesting that scientific findings around them should be used to buttress Christian doctrine, or suggesting that science doesn't exist and it's not real anyway, and going one extreme or another. And few people who Nieto was in contact with, because he was quite an erudite and intellectual and quite interfaith activist guy, actually were trying to say, no, these scientific findings that Boyle and Newton and all these great minds of the scientific enlightenment are coming out with, they can help us to develop our understanding of religion. That's where he was coming from when he delivered that sermon. What he really said, and if you go back and look at it, which I did, it's really interesting, what he really said is that Judaism never had a word for nature. That was his point. And he challenged the people in Shul that day to go home and find anywhere in Jewish literature where nature was used in the way it is used in Western Christian discourse, as capital N nature, to refer to the natural world, to the nature of things that happen automatically. He said, Maimonides uses the word teva, nature, to describe the nature of something, the qualities of something. Maimonides says that fire has its nature as being dry and hot. Okay, but that's not the same as capital N nature. And actually, although Rabbi Nieto did not have Sepharia at his fingertips, he would have enjoyed it if he did, he was right. Nobody used Hateva to refer to nature the way that we do now in much of Jewish history until the medieval period. And that was largely as a result of Christian influence and Christian scholarship. So actually he was right when he said that Judaism doesn't have a word for nature. And what he was suggesting is that what other people say when they say nature is what we call God. They say, oh yes, nature is that the clouds form and the rain comes down to earth. We say God makes the clouds form and the rain comes down to earth. So in Nieto's mind, you could look at any example where someone else talks about capital N nature and replace it with God, and that would be an understanding of how Jews view the natural world. That actually isn't that controversial. But he didn't have time to explain it that way, or if he did, nobody really cared to listen. And in the meantime, Joshua Tzarfati, who left that wedding and left his meeting with the Mahamad very angry, went around trying to convince other people in the congregation that Rabbi Nieto was a heretic. Things got out of hand pretty quickly, which you can imagine is not too difficult to do. Sarfati presented a formal proposal to the Mahamad, asking them to write to the community in Amsterdam, which was considered the quote-unquote mother church of the Spanish and Portuguese community, and asking them to rule on whether or not Nieto was a heretic. They initially refused to do so. And so Sarfati raised the stakes. This is my favorite part of the story. He suggested to the Mahamad that actually if he was wrong and Nieto was validated by a more esteemed rabbi in Amsterdam, then he would give £100 to the synagogue. Now this is 1703. According to the Bank of England's calculator, £100 then is £20,440 today. Which is a great way to raise money for synagogues, by the way, is piss people off and then get them to bet on whether or not you can prove them wrong. As it was, the Mahamad did not take the bet. They refused to take the bet, which is probably a bad thing in retrospect because they could have earned a lot of money. And they banned Sarfati from entering the synagogue. They made the Parnasim announce at synagogue the next Shabbat that Joshua Sarfati was not to come in, and they blocked the door to him. This escalated very quickly, because other people then started saying they were on Sarfati's side. They also then got banned from the synagogue. Within a few months, you had a situation where literally dozens of members of the community were now being banned from entering the synagogue because they refused to tolerate Rabbi Nieto's view on God and nature. The most miraculous part of this story, a genuine Hanukkah miracle, is that the Mahamad sided with the rabbi, right? They defended Rabbi Nieto so much so, they're willing to cast out many prominent members of their community who had been financial donors, by the way, because Sarfati's argument was that he should have a say publicly because he donated to the building, which just feels very modern in many ways. And despite that, the Mahamad still felt comfortable defending Rabbi Nieto. However, they also kind of botched it. First, they told the dissenters they would send a letter to Amsterdam and get the view of the Esnoga on the issue, and then they refused to send the letter, and said they sent the letter but didn't send the letter, and then a group of people from the synagogue sent their own letter in secret to the community in Amsterdam, which then the Mahamad found out about, so they sent their letter too late. And now the community in Amsterdam had 2 letters from 2 different people, both representing this community in England, which at the time was quite a backwater in the eyes of Amsterdam Sephardi Jews. And they said, you know what, never mind, we're not answering either letter. So the result was they still had no resolution, and now there was a list of 14 people who had signed their names to say that they wanted a view on this because they thought Nieto was a heretic. They also got banned. All of them. Banned overnight. A huge amount of people were put in cherem over the accusation of heresy against the rabbi. It got worse, and so much so that one of the major figures in the community, a lay retired rabbi, a revered older rabbi who was a poet and scholar, who is not someone who's known to me, but evidently was quite famous at the time, Ibn Danon, who had this great significance in the community, he said that he thought Sarfati might be on the right track. They banned him too, and they prevented him from being buried in the cemetery. That caused quite a kerfuffle, as you can imagine. It got worse and worse and worse over the course of 1703. In the meantime, Nieto himself, ever sensible to the PR challenge this presented, went to a Christian publisher in London and wrote a pamphlet explaining what he meant to say in that sermon on November 20th, 1703, which I'm sure he regretted ever having given, and wrote a whole pamphlet that then was disseminated under a secret alias to the community, hoping that people would then go, oh, actually, this makes sense, and he could surprise reveal and say, it was me! See, you agree with me! It didn't really work either, but the pamphlet does survive, and it was written in Portuguese in London in 1703, the assumption being the only people who would read it would be the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who spoke Portuguese or version of it as their first language. Eventually, and this is not my favorite part of the story, the Ashkenazim had to save the day, which is upsetting to every Sephardi who ever can imagine, because the Sephardim couldn't sort it out for themselves, and there was an Ashkenazi figure in another central London community who heard about this whole drama and spoke to them and said, listen, why don't you ask my rabbi? I'll send him a letter in Altona in Germany, and he'll give you an answer. Now, we know that rabbi now as Chacham Tzvi, which is unusual that an Ashkenazi rabbi is called Chacham anything. The reason he's called Chacham Tzvi is because he helped solve this crisis for the Sephardim, and as a result, they respected him so much, they insisted he go by Chacham Tzvi, and he was so flattered, he did so for the rest of his life. Also an interesting story. Anyways, the Chacham Tzvi in Altona in Germany gets all of this correspondence. It's in Portuguese. He sends it back and says, I can't read this. They have someone from the Ashkenazi community translate it in order for him to be able to understand what's going on. He deliberates on it and eventually sends back a letter in 1704, authorized not only by himself, but by 2 other rabbis, acting as a Beit Din, saying that not only is Nieto correct, he's absolutely not a heretic, and his views are reflected in all sorts of traditional sources. And they pointed out that Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari says something very similar about nature and its relationship with God. They even, which is shocking, I'm sure, to the Sephardim and the Spanish and Portuguese community who did not like Kabbalah, they even pointed out that the medieval Kabbalists loved to play this game with the word Hateva, the nature, and the fact that it equals Elohim. They're both 86. And in numerous Kabbalistic sources, they play this game showing, look, God is nature, because they both equal the same number. So there's lots to go on to try and justify why Nieto was on solid ground. But only when the Chacham Tzvi stepped in to answer this was it actually resolved. No one knows what happened to Sarfati. I don't know if he was allowed back in synagogue. I don't know if all the other people who were banished from synagogue were allowed back in synagogue. But Nieto kept his job. He stayed the rabbi of Bevis Marks all the way until when he died in 1728. He was there for another nearly 25 years. His son becomes the rabbi after he dies. He's buried with honor in the cemetery in Mile End, still there today, the Sephardi cemetery there. And ultimately, although he kind of fades from history, and it's not something most people will ever have learned about when they learn about Anglo-Jewish history, it's the first example, really, of a accusation of heresy against a rabbi in the UK, and its echoes are definitely felt in the other 2 stories we're going to talk about, both of which are much more modern to our own time. Several interesting features about this story that I'll point out, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Abel, is that, first of all, it's one individual who accuses the rabbi of heresy, and it spirals out of control very quickly because the synagogue council deals with it badly, right? Lessons to be learned there, people who sit on synagogue councils and trustee boards. Also, a lot of it revolves around what other authorities can be brought in order to verify. You can sense in the community's discourse a real insecurity. They couldn't solve this for themselves. They were desperate for someone else to come in and tell them, was Rabbi Nieto correct or not? And whether that was the synagogue in Amsterdam, or whether that was an Ashkenazi rabbi from Altona, which is shocking they would even look that way, but they were so desperate for someone significant to tell them an answer, that it actually became not about whether Nieto was right, but about who would say he was right and who would not. And often, when it comes to accusations of heresy, that is actually the distinction that's being taken place, is who's on whose side, rather than who said what, and what does it actually mean. Also central to this whole debate is the question of how rabbis who are trying to be modern integrate scientific knowledge, scientific learning, stuff they've learned from outside of Judaism into their religious teaching without it necessarily being accused of being something heretical. There's a big difference between what Nieto said and what Spinoza said, but to the ears of his listeners, they were exactly the same, or at least to some of them. And making those distinctions is often very difficult. And so part of the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is there even an inclination to have an idea of heresy? What does heresy even mean in a religion, if it is a religion, which doesn't have a dogma? And as a result, I think we can see that heresy is often not so much about the ideas, but about how those ideas touch on pressure points in Jewish community organization, in power politics, and in people's conceptions of themselves and their communities and their identity as it's linked to the particular figures who lead them. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Rabbi Abel, who's going to take us way into the future to talk about Rabbi Sacks and the accusations against him as a heretic.
Stand.
No, please.
I think standing is a bit easier for me sometimes. Thank you, Rabbi Adam, very much indeed for that. I need to confess that I am actually related to the Portuguese Sarfatis, and my wife is a descendant of the Portuguese Ibn Danons.
Oh, there you go.
Neither of us agree with either of them.
Right, okay.
There we are.
Good sign.
So I'm going to first of all talk about the 2010, the controversy which actually never erupted, but by all accounts should have been the one to have erupted. And that was a program that Rabbi Sacks put together, The Case for God. Effectively, he was putting his own faith on trial, he said so. He invited various participants to come and join him in the studio. He was in complete control of the TV program, hosted by the BBC. And one particular partner to discussion was the redoubtable Howard Jacobson, fellow Mancunian. Booker Prize, etc., etc. We all know him. Journalist, sharp fella. And he's sitting there with Rabbi Sacks. I actually have a clip here, but we don't necessarily have to see it, but we could do, potentially. But from memory, I'll tell over what was there. First of all, just please do indicate, has anybody seen the Howard Jacobson Jonathan Sacks Case for God interchange? Right, it was back in 2010. It's so worth it. You only need to Google it, YouTube it, and it's there on a YouTube recording for all to see.
Was that the Rosh Hashanah
Yes.
Address?
Pre-Rosh Hashanah, 2010. So it was a set of programs leading up to, intentionally to prepare for Rosh Hashanah. You get to the point where there's a debate between Jonathan Sacks and Howard Jacobson over God. Is this God that we're talking about a loving God, or is it an awesome or fear-inspiring God? And what Jonathan Sacks homes in on is how God is in every detail, and says God is in the detail. And Howard Jacobson turns to him and says, no, he says, Chief Rabbis, or Jonathan as he calls him, the devil is in the detail. And he says, and furthermore, he says, does God really care about these particulars of what I wear and what I eat? If I have a bacon sandwich for breakfast, does it really matter? And you see that Jonathan Sacks is just beginning to feel a little bit shaky because his body language, it's so important to be able to see this because his body language really tells all. And from there, it's sort of downhill for Jonathan Sacks because Howard Jacobson has got him, beginning to get him where he wants him. And so Jonathan Sacks goes into talking about how God is very loving and how Jonathan also loves Hal Jacobson very much indeed, despite the fact, and have I disappointed you, Chief Rabbi? No, you have not. I still love you, and all the rest of it. It looks a little bit Christian at some point with this type of beneficent love going on between almost like bishop and commoner. And then Howard Jacobson pops a question. He says, but Jonathan, he says, do you really believe that he's there? And Jonathan Sacks, at that point, doesn't respond. And he indicates a tremendous nervousness. He doesn't answer for what seems like an eternity. And he looks at Howard Jacobson and smiles, and Howard smiles, and then Chief Rabbi Sacks laughs, and then he comes out with the following. He says, I have hope, and faith, for me, is coping with uncertainty. Now, let's just put the words or the denomination orthodox to the side for a moment, right? But certainly if you are talking about a rabbi that by default or by choice is to be seen as orthodox, and for that matter in many areas of not orthodox denominations, to turn to a rabbi and actually say, do you believe that there is a God out there, that God that you're talking about, is he really there? And to not be able to say anything other than, well, yes, for me anyway, it is a no. I don't know if you'd agree. So I would actually just take a very, very quick poll over here. If I was to be questioned and asked, is God out there, anywhere, does he exist? And I were not to be able to say yes, but I would say that it's an area of complete uncertainty to me. Would you still consider me, I'm going to take two questions I'm going to field. First of all, would you consider me still to be a rabbi? Hands up if you think so. Oh wow, that's very generous. Okay. How many of you would still consider me to be an Orthodox rabbi? Only one. Well, and you're the Orthodox Jew in the crowd for sure. So that's wonderful. Okay, thank you very much for that, David. Well, okay. So it's at that point that Howard Jacobson comes back on the rebound with tremendous force. He says, but Jonathan, I do believe that there is a God out there. And so suddenly, Jonathan seems to sink into the ground, and Howard Jacobson comes out as the new chief rabbi. But I do believe in that great and awesome God, the God that spoke out of a whirlwind to Job, and said to him, by the way, do you know how many chapters he goes on for? God and Job, about 3 chapters, yes? And don't you think that I am the God who created everything, and how can you think otherwise? And I'm the one who makes everything gyrate and turn round, and the solar system and everything in it. This great and awesome God, which, by the way, is the prophetic God, isn't it? That, when I walked into the rabbinate, I was once approached by a gentleman who came into the synagogue and said, look, I've got 3 Haredi children in Gateshead. They actually do the Luach Zmanim for the country, for those who'll pick it up from them. And he said, I belong to the Reform. I've been a member of the Reform all my life. I was at the time rabbi in Walthamstow Synagogue, and he said, would you have me if I joined your synagogue? I said, without any doubt, of course I would do. Oh, he said, I wasn't expecting that response. He said, because you do understand that I am a Jew of Isaiah, not a Jew of Moses. He said, well, I happen to be a Jew of both, so whichever one you want to link into is fine by me. He wasn't expecting that either. He went upstairs, came back down, and he said, I've just signed out a cheque for £10,000. That sort of, sorts out the burial dues and so on and so forth. He said, and that's why I joined, because none of my sons would be present at my burial when it takes place if I didn't join a synagogue that wasn't Reform. And it just shows you the schisms and the tremendous, where we are nowadays. But we know that, don't we? So, okay. So that's the 2010 one. In some detail. The 2001 was not just one controversy, there were several that year. I remember sitting in Finchley Synagogue when at the time someone called Ephraim Mervis, who was actually his synagogue at the time, got up and said, "I do not agree with you, Chief Rabbi, and I am not going to support you." He wanted a unanimous declaration that what he'd written in the Guardian at the time that was critical of the actions of the State of Israel or its government was, what he'd written about it was in order, and all the rabbis supported him, and Ephraim Mervis led the rebellion. Yes, and that was just one thing taking place at the time. There was at least one other issue that was also quite a controversy, but the main one, of course, for me materialised when at the time I was a rabbi in Princess Road Synagogue in Liverpool, and a book came thudding through my door onto the doorstep. All right, the dignity of difference, and I opened the door and said, "By the way, who's just thrown this through my letterbox?" And it was a lady who was very triumphant and says, "Finally, we have a rabbi who's prepared to say what needs to be said, and that's our chief rabbi." So I opened it up, and there was page 55, and what did it say? God revealed himself to the Jews through Judaism, to Christians through Christianity, and to Muslims through Islam. Well, at that point, the book might as well have burst into a conflagration. I knew that this was going to be incendiary, that this was going to get passions moving, if passions can ever get moved in Anglo-Jewish. This would do it. And it did. It didn't take long at all for that to happen. And, of course, so the way The Guardian had it on the 26th of October 2002 was that Rabbi Hona Halpern, of course, this is quite interesting because Hona Halpern's now passed on to the next world. He was born in Czechoslovakia in 1922, and he was responsible for the training of at least one current member of the London Beth Din. So it's the trusted institution to supply, to direct, and to guide, whatever that will consist of, those who will become the ecclesiasts for some of the people in this room, not all, but most people looking up to an institution. Therefore, when Rabbi Hona Halpern spoke, it wasn't just a question of a senior member of the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations, aka Kadassia, who was going to say something about this terrible rabbi who had said sinful things. He actually used the verse from Mishlei, V'shem Reshaim Yirkav, may the name of the evil rot. That is the worst curse you can give any other Jew, by the way, just in case you were looking for something to curse someone with. Now you know what it is. V'shem Reshaim Yirkav, let alone another rabbi, let alone the chief rabbi of that generation. He said he has to repent of this sin. Now it's a little bit of a paradox here, because you usually say V'shem Reshaim Yirkav, the name of the wicked shall rot, about someone who's completely betrayed the community, turned everyone over to our enemies, and we're rotting in jail because of it. Yes? It doesn't equate with being able to repent for your sin. It's when it's far gone past that particular point. Nonetheless, it was all the hyperbole he could summon at the time. And Rabbi Halpern insisted that every book would have to be hunted down, mopped up, including the one that landed on my doorstep, which I was not going to hand over to him, and would have to be incinerated and destroyed, just like you destroy any type of idolatry. Now, the interesting thing is that there are 3 bits of the 13 principles of faith, which is not the only list of principles of faith that exists, of course. There are shorter ones and there are different ones. In fact, the Karaites, I think, have got 10. And one of them is the Hebrew language, which has been sadly forgotten by Orthodox Jews as being a principle of faith. But never mind. There is nothing in the 13 principles of faith that actually says that there is no truth amongst the nations. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say that God never revealed himself to the other nations. In fact, we just mentioned Job a moment ago, thanks to Howard Jacobson, and God speaks to Job and tells him all sorts of things. Now, if Job had gone off, by the way, Job was not a Jew, he was an Arab. He lived in what is now Oman. He was an Aramean Arab, a crossover of the two. If he'd gone off and formed a spiritual pathway of any kind, then we'd have a non-Jewish spiritual pathway informed by a revelation of God that goes on for quite a bit. It goes on for at least as long as some of the best soliloquies of Moses in Deuteronomy. And yet, it's not Moses talking to the people of Israel hoping that somebody's staying awake to listen. It's coming from God to Job. And so what would be such a terrible thing if God revealed himself to other nations? Does that mean that our role amongst the nations is now suddenly dissolved and evaporated? Does it mean that it never happened? Does it mean that there isn't something unique in it anyway? And the Torah does say that. O hanisa Elohim lakachat lo goy mikerev goy b'masot b'otod u'moftim. Yeah, God took us out from amongst another nation for a liberation theology, which is now what our people are there for. That's what we facilitate, that's what we represent, that's what we are there to be. So, is there anywhere in the received orthodox, if you like, theology, when people actually bother to, when the Orthodox camps even have a look at it, for example, i.e. in Maimonides, that says that there cannot be a revelation of any kind to any other people? Of course, it was the particular reference to Christianity, the particular reference to Islam, that got people riled up. It becomes tribal at that point. Because it's Abrahamic, it's even worse. Yet, how can you range the one alongside the other? And what Jonathan Sacks then goes and says in that first original edition is, he says, what we have in this world, in other words, olam hazeh, are truths. Now, it has been suggested to me before that if you took an oath under Sacks on the Torah, it would say something like, I swear to tell a truth, a whole truth, and nothing but a truth. Yes? But this is where Jonathan Sacks, I suppose, put himself in the greatest peril, in the firing line, his head way above the parapet, and they went for him. Now, the trial that he was summoned to never took place in London, funnily enough. There was Hanukkah on Golders Green Road, but that wouldn't actually do it. Where do you think his trial took place? Anyone there? At that time, it was a place in which there was one united synagogue only in the area. Anyone know where it took place?
Liverpool.
Well, we haven't got that claim to fame. We could always rewrite history and say it took place there. Just a little way up the M62, if you please, in the city of my birth, in Manchester. In fact, it was in Salford. So, Rabbi Yossi Chazan, who was a Lubavitcher, a tremendous scholar, by all means, but not necessarily a theologian, decided that, the chief rabbi had gone too far, this was not worthy of a chief rabbi or anything, and he was an apikoros. And we're going to summon him and we're going to bring him up here and we are going to tell him the time of day. He very meekly went up with Dayan Erentro, because Dayan Erentro said, listen, you better do everything I tell you to do now, because otherwise you are not going to survive. Okay, you've been, 10 years in this post. You've had what was the first decade called with Clive Lawton? A renewal, yes? So if you want to get past your renewal and get anywhere near your retirement, you're going to have to come with me. And I know he went up with him there, because I wasn't in the gathering that took place, but I was actually driving down the M1 when they came alongside with me, and I saw Dayan Erentro with Chief Rabbi like this. And I made some inquiries, and in fact, they'd taken him up there, and they said, look, there are a number of offending passages in that book, and you are going to have to expunge them. You're going to have to reprint that book. And he agreed. He reprinted that book, and it was printed again just this year. A reprint was made, and it says first edition. It's not the first edition, is it? It's not the first original edition, is it? And what then happened, and this bit I'm sure everyone's familiar with, is that the chief rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, late, ended up, sadly for him, alienating everybody. So he made enemies and he alienated his friends. I think it was a film named something like that as well, wasn't it? Because what he told the rabbis in Manchester was that what he had written, he'd written for the Gentiles, or the Goyim, you see. And what he was now going to reprint, obviously was going to be, by the dictat, would satisfy the Yidden. Now, of course, there's only one problem with that. There's actually, believe it or not, only one God. And there isn't a Gentile God that we can write about in one way and a Jewish God that we can write about in the other. If there is, great, but from the standpoint of being a rabbi and relating to God, you can't tell porkies about the Abishter just because you're talking to people who buy your book. So he must have been telling the truth. He then also told people in the United Synagogue that he never meant to make any of these changes. He was just under pressure. So obviously he lost friends there as well. It was at that point that I made myself a promise that whatever I would publish, as long as I didn't write absolute drivel or speak nonsense altogether, that I would stick by it and never recant. And it happened to me on a number of occasions that I was called up by certain people who felt that they could tell me a thing or two and say, you had better withdraw this or take that back. And whenever this happened, I was ready and I said, Jonathan Sacks made that mistake. I will not repeat it. Not in his lifetime and not after. And I have to say, that has always stood me in very good stead. But the question still remains, and with that I will sort of pull up and draw to a close so that we can go on to the next part of what we're doing. If you look into Maimonides, okay, so this will be Hilchot Mamrim, chapter 3, paragraph 6. Maimonides ranges for us, spells out or defines, gives us a set of definitions of 3 types of naughty Jews. Okay? By the way, this could be a naughty non-Jew as well. What's known as a min, which translates as sectarian, which makes you as bad as a Christian. Yes? Because that's minim, by the way, means Christians. You know when you say la malshinim in the Amidah, the original Eretz Yisrael version, untampered by the Vatican, actually says laminim, not la malshinim, or at least it says laminim first. As far as the Christians are concerned, please get them out of our hair, get rid of them, right? So there's an anti-Christian text certainly there. So a min is somebody who rejects God altogether, or God as we are supposed to know him, who's prepared even to say, an atheist would also be a type of min, there is no God. Then, down from there, you've got an apicorus, one of which definitions, according to Maimonides, is there is a God, but he doesn't talk to us. And then, down from there is a kofer, which is not a kofer ba'ikar, somebody who denies God altogether, that's a separate thing, but a kofer b'divrei chachamim, somebody who rejects the traditional interpretations of the Torah as handed down by the rabbis. That's one example of a kofer. The min and the apicorus, as Maimonides says, dispatch them to the next world as fast as you can. I don't think he even says you need to beth din for it. So there'll be literal backstabbing going on in the community if Maimonides had had his way. It's either hyperbole or he really meant it. That's the min, and that's the apicorus. A kofer, well, if you observe, so an example of a kofer, according to Maimonides, would be a Karaite, somebody who said, oh, you said, what's a God? Yes, he did communicate with us, they're the better at Bible than anyone else. However, no, we don't agree with everything the Chachamim taught us, and so long as the meat is kosher and the cheese is kosher, you can mix them into a pizza. That already makes them a kofer, but a kofer is different. Because if a kofer, according to Maimonides, writes a mezuzah, and he writes it, and you supervise the writing of the mezuzah, you can put it on your doorpost. Okay? Most people don't realize that that's possible. But the Karaites aren't so bad. If we were to look at these, at least the two examples we've had this evening, what do we have before us? The 2010 blow-up was not the only one. There was one much later, just shortly before before Jonathan Sacks retired, when he was stood accused again by a conglomerate of Manchester rabbis. These Manchester rabbis are such troublemakers. I know, because I come from there. They called him to account on having written, amongst other things, that it could be, and according to certain opinions, that large parts of Sefer Bereshit, of Genesis, never happened. They're a mashal. They are a parable. One of the, very reliable Rishonim have written things like this. Yes. The only thing is they don't get studied in yeshiva. So typically, people who are rabbis or sitting on Batei Din have never even studied through Ramban, let alone other sort of more remote ones to them, more remote Rishonim. They called him up, but this time Jonathan Sacks went prepared. He told me about that himself, and he said he had a shiur that took 3 hours that he delivered. So instead of having to answer questions, he gave the shiur, and they all had to sit there and listen. It blew their brains out. They'd never heard a thing of what they couldn't argue with it, because it was all as orthodox could ever be. How would they challenge commentators on the Torah that lived 1,000 years ago and 700 years ago? They just weren't. They knew they weren't competent to do it. So it took him 20 years to get to that point. However, by then, it may be that some fundamentals of Jonathan Sacks' faith had already come to a point where he felt very, very challenged internally as to whether he believed at all in a God out there. So he actually says in that 2010 interview, I would hope to know that historic God who first gave the call out to the Jewish people is still there. I don't know. I'm uncertain right now. So, on one hand, you go to Israel nowadays, and many members of the Haredi and the non-Haredi community as well in Israel call him, Rabbi Sacks, one of the greatest elucidators of Judaism and expressors of Judaism, and will even say Zichrono Livracha, Zecher Tzadik Livracha even. But the question is, why and how is it that he got away with it? And how could it possibly be that, anyway, Chacham Nieto got away with it? And both of their concerns come well within the min and the apikoros categories. Well within. For which you don't keep your job, you get dispatched. And yet, Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs has always been held up as the reason to reject a theologian within the Jewish community on grounds of apikoros, when all, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the most shocking of all of the things was, what happened at Sinai? How do we see that? How do we interpret that? Well, that doesn't even come. It's a safek it's a discussion in the area of kfirah. It doesn't deny that God relates to us. It just asks how, because you can't just take these things in a simplistic way. So for me, it's been a journey to get to where I am today, but here I am, and I suppose for me the most important thing is, what are we looking at? We need to see the wood for the trees. We mustn't allow ourselves, simply because somebody happens to fall into a social, political, communal category of being orthodox or non-orthodox, that we have to either accept unquestioningly, and certainly not to slam and condemn. Never. We must engage and we must study together to improve our own understanding of the good and where it comes from.
Rabbi Abel, thank you. I think all three of us are committing something of a heresy by not talking about Israel or anti-Semitism today and how wonderful that is. Let me start, if I may, just by quoting, as it's Hanukkah, Rabbi Jacobs' entry in the Jewish religion, his entry for Hanukkah. The problem, and then we'll take a vote, as the others have also invited, is this heresy. The problem of the origin of Hanukkah is complicated. According to some historians, the origins are to be found in pagan celebrations, the 8-day festival of tabernacles. Yet it's undoubtedly the miracle of the oil that has captured the Jewish imagination through the ages. Some scholars see the emphasis on the miracle as due to the disillusionment of later generations with the Maccabees, so that the victory came to be interpreted in terms of the spiritual power of the Torah, symbolized by the oil that burns miraculously, even when, according to the natural order, the light should have gone out. Many Orthodox Jews refuse to speak of the Talmudic story at all as legend, believing it to be historical fact. Let's take the vote. Is that heresy? Okay, perhaps not here, but take it to Stanford Hill, where you're told about the origins of Hanukkah as being derived from paganism, or the other reference to the oil as not perhaps being fundamental. Perhaps it may well be considered as such. I think the other interesting thing about what's referenced here is very Rabbi Jacobs, that we have virtually on every page of Rabbi Jacobs, which he is obsessed with a historical consciousness, and also at the same time obsessed with divinity too. And what we have here is very much like the model that we have from the very beginning. In fact, from 1944, where he wrote one of his first articles to the Jewish Chronicle. I think the reason Adam Nieto wasn't in trouble was because the Jewish Chronicle didn't fit in 1703. And there we have, in 1944, his Cheshire Cat model. He referred to the grinning Cheshire Cat. The Cheshire Cat being represented in his mind by the yeshiva world, the grin being the grin of Jews College at the time. That has irony for a whole load of reasons, and of course he borrowed it from Alice in Wonderland. But again and again we have this combination both of tradition and also scholarship that he looked throughout his career to synthesize. Let's just reference part of that letter, if I may. If we can be forgiven the irreverence, we may say that the English yeshivas provide the Cheshire Cat without its cheerful grin. Jews College provides the grin without the cat. The time is surely ripe for a new institution, one that will combine the deep piety and love of Torah Lishma, of the yeshiva, with the Polish, the modern methods, and the efficacy of Jews College too. We also have, with I think that Hanukkah entry, the notion that that one is, as he goes on to talk about, one is fulfilling the commandment of lighting the candles, and that goes to show how God's encounter is through the Jewish people rather than to the Jewish people. The next thing that I want to share, again important referencing the Jewish Chronicle, is an article which William Frankel, who for many years had been editor of the Jewish Chronicle, which he wrote in Manna magazine in 1987. And the article was called Dissent, Not Heresy. And I quote, "There is an increasing desire from our religious, secular and Zionist authorities to equate dissent with heresy. Our leadership as a whole favors secrecy and conformity discourages innovation, and is fearful of controversy. And I think again and again, Jacobs, perhaps like Sacks as well, actually were drawn close to this notion of dissent. They sailed close to the wind because I think that is where they saw the opportunity for growth. Sacks called us an iconoclastic people. We have broken the idols of the past again and again in order to remake tradition and make it relevant and new for each generation. And that is, I think, what Rabbi Jacobs was about again and again. We've all so far spoken about God. I think that Jacobs again and again in his writings upheld a theistic position. He was God intoxicated. For somebody most known for we have reason to believe, I actually think that he went far beyond reason in his appeal to us all in his writings. And there's a particular line. Something is far more involved in faith than assent to proposition. Jacobs's greatness again and again is his scholarship. And I think his scholarship scared people. I think that's what invited his controversy and the need to dismiss him because of his great mind. And again, he invited an approach which moderns and the Orthodox world didn't like, which was not an either or approach, but a both and approach. Judaism has always, as he argues, continually contained, as we saw in the Hanukkah passage, contained a multiplicity of arguments. It embraces paradox, and that is what Jacobs again and again was drawn to. I also think that he sailed close to the wind because he invited both the personal, individual quest as well as the communal. Judaism emphasizes, as he says, both the concept of the God of the fathers as well as the concept of my God. And that individual quest, that handing us, as it were, the power to invite our own quest, which he bequeathed to us, encouraging individuals to make decisions for themselves, critiquing the medieval approach of subscribing to constructed propositions which he felt were all too neat. That invited controversy. His God intoxication, I think also through that, in which he castigated a legalism, a kind of ancestor worship, which he critiqued those of a more fundamentalist nature, the religious behaviorism, which he called out again and again, continually arguing against who argued that Judaism's emphasis on ritual marginalizes theology and the cultivation of faith in God, I think also invited controversy. But as his scholarship again and again was always backed up by a focus on the sources and an argument that the tradition itself can withstand anything that is thrown up at it. Of course, Torah min hashamayim was the big subject to which he was accused of the heresy that he was, and yet so much is misunderstood in this way. Of course, the word min has been used in a different context, But min was Rabbi Jacobs's big problem. It wasn't so much Torah, it wasn't so much Shamayim that the problem that he encountered was, but the word min, meaning that of course he of course explored. How does the from take place? And yet again and again, his argument is backed up by tradition. He of course cannot accept the literalist position of Maimonides, and specifically his eighth principle of faith. But again and again, he uses the structure of tradition to back up his argument. And I quote, this is from Principles of Faith. He says on the eighth principle, to give up this principle is to abandon Judaism as a religion, but to accept it in the way that's formulated by the great sage of Cordoba, by Maimonides, is to tie Judaism down to fundamentalism and obscurantism. So Jacobs rejects the orthodox dogmatism that he encounters. And he does this in all sorts of ways. He uses history itself to engage with what Maimonides himself was doing in the context of the time in which he was writing, to defend Judaism from Muslim critique. And he shows that this kind of propositional like notions of faith were certainly not the only way. And he says again and again that the dogmatism gained in the modern period. He wanted to cast that aside and like demonstrate how the tradition has buttressed this over time, and this was in strong counter distinction to many of those scholars around him that wanted to opt for the either or, as opposed to the both and model. For example, Shlomo Danziger in the US, who was like writing about a number of modern Orthodox people in the 60s, Eliezer Berkovitz, Irving Greenberg, and so on, any attempt expressed or implied to qualify the external objective reality of the revelation of written oral Torah, any tendency to rationalize it philosophically as a historical development of spiritual insight and response, must be considered a critical departure from what we mean by Torah min hashamayim. So he faced this continual backdrop, but of course he used plenty of arguments from tradition, from Torah itself, which has a minimalist approach in both Exodus 19:20 and also in Deuteronomy itself. And then of course that wonderful the wonderful midrash from Bava Metzia 59b, which speaks really about the Torah not being in heaven. And then of course from Menachot 29b, that will be famous to us, which of course has Moses sitting in the back of Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva and Moses not understanding what was going on, demonstrating how we come to understand Torah differently in different ages. So plenty of arguments again and again to back up how we can respond to the challenges faced with a new understanding and biblical scholarship and so on, that of course he was not prepared to reject for the sake of truth. And then, and perhaps finally, and then I'll conclude and then look forward to our discussion together, Never, I think, should we underestimate in all of these cases the importance of sociological, psychological situation of what was occurring. And there were plenty of rabbis that perhaps didn't have Rabbi Jacobs's standing, that said very similar things. So why was it that Rabbi Jacobs was so cast aside? And I think it really comes down to the authority of the chief rabbi at the time, who was under attack, like with this. Not necessarily the theology of what was being discussed. And then, of course, just Rabbi Jacobs's background with his strong pedigree. How could, a Manchester yeshiva, Manchester again, Gateshead, Kollel, educated person come up with the sort of things that he did, and this couldn't be tolerated. To conclude, in an interview with Elliot Cosgrove for his PhD, Jacobs quoted approvingly Walt Whitman, "Do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself. I am huge, I contain multitudes." Again and again, Jacobs was keen to ensure that the full multiplicity of the tradition was open and available to all, and the quest that he invited us all to take and the personal approach is what he encouraged again and again. He, of course, insisted on the importance of both the historical consciousness as so fundamental to how we should approach things, and yet also calling for the authority of ritual as well. And on that note, I shall conclude and look forward to our discussion together.
Just a few words, I think, to wrap up, and then happy to have any questions or thoughts people have they want to share. We've kind of done this piecemeal thing of looking at 300 years of Anglo-Jewish history and 3 different accusations of heresy. I'll share my own conclusions, which I think are that more or less heresy doesn't really exist as a concept in terms of theology. All 3 of the gentlemen we've discussed were accused of the highest level, it would seem, of heretical views, and yet the determining factor in whether they survived that or not was less about the actual nature of those views and more about the political and social structures they were within and how they managed to use those to their advantage or not. Is there a future in which Rabbi Jacobs could have retained his status in the United Synagogue? I'm sure it's possible if he was willing to recant, if he was willing to bring in the right authorities from overseas to help him. Maybe he could have had a different outcome, but the outcome is perhaps the most interesting thing, because as the one that is obviously informing a lot of the approach we've taken, I think there's a sense here that Rabbi Jacobs, in his accusations of heresy, responded in the best way, perhaps, which is simply to ignore the accusation as having any validity whatsoever and embrace the idea that we can have and contain multitudes as a Jewish community without needing to apologize for that. And that certainly can be a good rubric moving forward, but one that I think many Jews still in the Anglo-Jewish community would not necessarily agree with. Should we open it up? Thoughts, comments, critiques? Anyone want to call us a heretic? Now's your chance.
I mean, just on that, Jacobs is much braver than Sacks.
Yeah.
And also, I actually think there's something about timing, which is again and again critical. And what if Jacobs had said, I think, what he said, today, certainly in some parts of the Orthodox world, I think it would be considered kosher. And I mean, Mary Freud Kandel in her book, speaks about from Jacobs to the Torah.com.
Right.
But I think Jacobs is conservative. Today, perhaps, even in parts of Orthodoxy.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a word on courage. Yeah, courage is a divine characteristic that we're encouraged to take. The prophet says, and this is I want to dedicate what I'm doing this evening to my parents' 53rd wedding anniversary, which is tonight. because my parents. Thank you. Because they live in Jerusalem. My parents encouraged me to be a Bible-based Jew. And that is what is the beginning and the end of it. It's not the Alpha and Omega, it's the Aleph and Taf. It has to be that way. And one prophecy where God pins his own colors to his own mast is Ani Adonai lo shaniti. I am the Lord, I have not changed. I don't change, I am the way I am. Take me the way I am. Subjecting yourself to the ebb and flow of requirements of society around you. Yes, we're all supposed to assimilate to some degree. Yes, we expect to. Yes, we need to be adaptable. Indeed, we do. But to fundamentally change what we believe in just so that we can hold on to our jobs, no. Then you leave your job. I've been challenged a couple of times in the United Synagogue, not necessarily because of heresy of one kind or another, or because of the courage that I took to say certain things, but I was, on more than one occasion, it was suggested to me that I better just rein myself in and not say certain types of things in my sermon. The genre of my sermons had become much more conservative and less challenging, and my response was, I will be very happy to go and drive a truck. Of course, this was met with incredulity. What do you mean, drive a truck? So there are different ways of earning a living. I certainly don't need to do it this way. So if you have to go as far as to be seen by everyone who admires you, to republish your book and take bits out, well, they cannot. By definition, you're too famous. You're too well known to actually do a revision at that point. You're out being viewed by everybody. That actually would only cause a person on the inside to break up, to fragment. This is not Ani Adonai lo sheni. You may say, well, it's all right for God not to change, but we're mere humans, we're weak. But we in Judaism do not make the claim that the will is great and the flesh is weak. We leave that to a Christian viewpoint that we don't hold by. What we hold by is imitatus Dei. We follow the ways of God. B'chol derachecha da'ehu. Know him in all your ways. He is courageous. You also have to have the courage of your convictions. Rabbi Louis Jacobs had the courage of his convictions, and at least one result that went with him was that there were enough people in those days and at those times, however tumultuous and upsetting and undermining and upsetting that they were, but he had enough people to step out of one synagogue to go and form another. I do not believe for one moment that there would be such a move that would support a rabbi nowadays in a similar circumstance in this country. Absolutely not. There isn't that courage.
Thank you. Let's open up. I'm curious what other people have to say or think or share with us about this whole question of who's the real Apikoros. Heard enough from us. Any thoughts? Yeah, please. Nice and loud if you can. Okay. I know we failed on the microphone front. I'm really sorry. But...
I don't understand.
Okay.
I think there's a difference between Judaic history and Jewish history. And I think there are Judaic interpretations of Hanukkah, and there's the classic Jewish history in which the Hashmonaim revolted against the Greco-Syrians in the 160s, and they defeated their enemies, and a Jewish state came into existence in the year 140 BCE. You can embellish it with Judaic ritual. If you take Purim, I don't think that Purim happened historically, but you can interpret that Judaically. So I think there's a difference. I think there's also a very thin dividing line between a heretic and a dissident, and you could argue that being a heretic is a very fine Jewish tradition. Yeah, and you could, I think Rav Kook said that every Jew, even the atheistic kibbutzniks, had a nitzutz within, a divine spark. So even if you're a heretic, are you still a Jew? These are the questions which come up to me. The other point on Bevis Marx, which I thought was very interesting. The Ashkenazim came to England in 1690, so there wouldn't have been too many Ashkenazim around in 1703. So that may be the reason why they had to go to Altona to find someone to give them the right answer, the correct answer. And the other thing I couldn't understand actually is that I know in 1703 the English were fighting the Spanish. So why was it called the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue? Wouldn't they have gone to trouble?
It wasn't them.
It's bizarre.
We just call it that now.
Yeah. And so it was called differently, you think, in 1703?
I'm sure I mean, others can correct me, I might know better, but I don't think anyone used the term Spanish and Portuguese Jews until long after. Yeah.
There's no Sharshamayim.
Yeah, it's just Sharshamayim. It wasn't called Bevis Marx either. It was just Sharshamayim.
The final point is, I actually reviewed many years ago The Dignity of Difference, which the title itself is a statement. And I reviewed the first edition very positively, and I reviewed the revised edition very negatively. And I think that Jonathan Sacks, or the how shall I put it, the writers and the intellectuals and the academics in Anglo-Jewish within the fold, people that perhaps weren't Jewish in a conventional religious sense. And you've spoken about the differences between Louis and Jonathan Sacks. I think there was a confluence in the sense that both of them were intellectuals, both of them had something to say, and I found it very interesting about Mervis opposing Jonathan Sacks. Jonathan Sacks wrote 1,001 books, Mervis hasn't written any. And that's the fundamental difference. And I think that the problem that exists is that British Jewry, Anglo Jewry, does not welcome people with an intellectual disposition, because intellectuals, academics, writers, they ask questions, and questions challenge conformity, and that I think is the essential. So in one sense, what happened with Louis and the challenges to Jonathan Sacks, I think are broader than looking at Judaism and synagogues and all the rest of it. It's a part of the Anglo-Jewish perspective, which you don't find in the States, for example. Here the Jews think of themselves as a minority in previously a so-called Christian country. I don't think that exists in the States. And so I think anything which is, slightly challenging in an intellectual sense, Jonathan Sacks or Louis Jacobs will be opposed by people like Ephraim Mervis.
Thank you.
You're certainly looking at what has been opposed.
Yeah.
I think that everybody made the right decision to revise that first edition, because the statement which he made from an Orthodox perspective was a little bit wild and indefensible. And his statement to defend it was a little bit crazy as well, saying that he says one thing to the non-Jews and another thing to the Jews. And by trying to say, there's multiple truths, that kind of an idea is so kind of absurd when they contradict each other. It's kind of it kind of cuts under orthodoxy in a sense. By taking the position which one might look at as not brave, it actually protects Orthodox Judaism. I think it was a sensible kind of decision.
Certainly allowed him to continue having the ability to speak to so many people. You could argue pragmatically there's a big benefit to having that position, and the way he's respected by non-Jewish communities still is tremendous. I mean, it's probably had more influence on non-Jews than on Jews as a result of his writing and public intellectual work.
If you see his revised versions, they still carry, laudatory words from the Archbishop of Canterbury. You're not going to retract them for that reason. It's more about the perception.
Other thoughts before we make a conclusion? Any thoughts in particular for Hanukkah? We thought Hanukkah was a good time to talk about heretics. Like the good example. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to note that We Have Reason to Believe was published in 1954. 1957. But the actual controversy itself didn't break out until
61, 62.
So it actually, no one read that book for some time. And if they hadn't made a big deal about what a heretic he was.
Yeah. What if Joshua Sarfati hadn't come to synagogue that morning, right? Like,
Exactly. I think there's something there around kind of like, even if you believe in heresy, like, don't spread it.
right.
By talking about it.
Yeah. Certainly the case. I think the press and social media makes this whole discussion of how we put people forward and judge whether their views are acceptable or not in a very different dialogue. And certainly, Rabbi Nieto would have struggled if Joshua Sarfati could have written to the JC. And in a sense, you can see the same issues reflected, right? Writing pamphlets and circulating them, and nothing's really changed. So there's some comfort, perhaps, in the Kohelet type familiarity of a story from 300 years ago that could have happened today. And both are still about power.
Just on that point, I mean, when in 1957 Jacobs wrote "We Have Reason to Believe," the syllabus at Jews College, although it was linked at the time to University of London, had biblical criticism as part of the agenda. Going to ask Rabbi Abel if biblical scholarship is on your Montefiore program that look forward to hearing about. But actually, what Jacobs didn't want to do was be seen to be a kind of schizophrenic, wearing like one hat in the university and another hat in the yeshiva. I think it's the sociological point, that kind of blew the gasket in the early 60s with the challenge to the chief rabbi, the future of the chief rabbinate in the 60s that kind of like lifted it, that blew the lid like a bit later.
Just if I may, wanted to question the lesson, Rabbi Abel, you drew from the Sacks episode, which is that you never rewrite your book. That's the one lesson you learned. You write your book, and then people can say what they like, but you're not going to rewrite it. But in a sense, if you're going to be writing a book when you're 30, and you get to 70, and you spent 40 years studying, discussing, absorbing, criticizing, should you not be able to change your position to make it more contemporary, where, as I think it's not a secret, at New North London, we will in the fullness of time be looking for a new rabbi. Is it beyond question, which I think is what you're saying, that you would not find somebody who may be on the left wing of the United Synagogue who might go through some form of intellectual change and find himself comfortable to put him or herself forward for a position in the Masorti synagogue?
So now I'll republish what I said before. Yeah. So what I hope to convey and what I want to convey is that it has very much to do with giving one message at one time, not knee-jerk reaction, giving a revised message to replace the message you've just given because some people are reacting badly to it. What you do need to do is engage those people at that time and do exactly what Jonathan Sacks told me to do. And what I haven't mentioned is I had a one-to-one relationship with Jonathan Sacks for years, and we discussed things that nobody else discussed together. He would call me once a month and say, what shall I speak about this month to the boys in the Smicha program, as it was, yeah? And I used to give him a hot topic. He would say, another hot potato from you, Rabbi. And my response was, if it weren't for the fact that you're a chief rabbi, I wouldn't hand you anything else. That is what we do. So, absolutely, I totally agree with you that what I am now at the age of 50 is most certainly not how I expressed myself at the age of 25. Yes, I wouldn't expect it to be. I would fundamentally disagree with the Rabbi Abel of 25 years ago on a number of things. I would definitely expect it to be the case. Solomon the Wise is said to have published 3 works that are all in the Bible, and one has got very little to do with the other in terms of the way it expresses itself. Has very much, as the Talmud points out, got to do with the age and stage of life and the experience that goes with it. That's a very different reason why you might want to publish a new edition of what you've previously published.
And what you've just said really is the Talmudic way. You don't retract, you add, and you debate, and you continue. Like Rabbi Jacobs wrote many things that he disagreed with himself on, like various decades later, but he didn't retract the original.
You put the conversation in public and you allow it to take place. And, you know, the theme in all of these stories is probably that when you try and shut down the conversation and you try and limit people's ability to express their views on Judaism, you end up in this situation of a heresy toggle switch, and that's not really accurate to Jewish history and the way in which certainly our sages have represented themselves historically. There's nothing wrong with sometimes saying things that maybe contradict things you said other times, or things that maybe provoke people to be uncomfortable, or things that might even be perceived to be, would you say, sailing the wind of dissent. It's part of the discourse and dialogue of Judaism, the way in which it functions best. And hopefully by investigating those 3 stories this evening, we've reminded ourselves a little bit about why that's so important. And if you find anyone that's accused of heresy, I'd encourage you to go listen to them rather than run away, because at least on the evidence of these 3 gentlemen, they probably have something very interesting to say. Thank you very much for being here. I don't know, Ivor, if you want to say a few words, but really a pleasure, especially a pleasure to have Rabbi Abel down here from the cold, wintry north. It's a rare occasion and a privilege for us to have him here. There's lots coming in the spring from Louis Jacobs Foundation, including, I believe, a chance to learn carefully both Miri's book about Rabbi Jacobs and a chance to learn carefully the 13 Principles book that Rabbi Jacobs wrote as well with Jeremy Gordon. So stay tuned for all of that.
תשיב בי את הרוח